The gun, oil, and leather scent of the saddle shop had become Harrison Cole's entire world since the day he buried his wife and infant daughter 3 years ago in the frozen ground of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. He was 28 years old, but the lines around his eyes belonged to a man twice his age, and nobody in town could remember the last time they had seen him smile. The winter of 1878 had settled over Wyoming territory with a vengeance, turning the rutted streets into frozen rivers of mud and forcing most folks to huddle near their stoves. Harrison worked from dawn until well past dark, his calloused hands crafting saddles and tack with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The work kept his mind occupied, kept the memories at bay, kept him from having to think about the empty house that waited for him each night. His younger brother Samuel had tried to coax him back to life countless times, inviting him to dinners and dances, but Harrison always refused with a curt shake of his head and returned to his leather and tools. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped so low that breath crystallized the moment it left a person's mouth. Marshal Tom Hendricks burst through the door of Harrison's shop, bringing with him a blast of frigid air and an expression of pure bewilderment. "Harrison, we have got a situation," Tom announced, stamping his feet on the wooden floor to shake off the snow. "That mail-order bride your brother sent away for just arrived on the morning stage." Harrison looked up from the saddle he was stitching, his dark eyes narrowing in confusion. "My brother did not send away for any mail-order bride. Samuel is not even looking to get married." Tom cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Well, according to this letter she is carrying, somebody using your name and address most certainly did. She came all the way from Boston, and she is standing out in the cold right now with 3 trunks and a bird cage." The leather needles slipped from Harrison's fingers and clattered onto the workbench. Ice flooded through his veins as understanding dawned. Samuel. His well-meaning, interfering, absolutely infuriating younger brother had done this. For months Samuel had been harping about how Harrison needed to move on, needed to live again, needed to open his heart. Apparently, Samuel had decided to take matters into his own hands. "I did not send for any bride," Harrison said flatly, rising to his feet. "Tell her there has been a mistake. Give her money for the return trip." "You tell her," Tom said, his weathered face creasing with sympathy. "I am not about to break that poor girl's heart. She has been traveling for near 3 weeks to get here." Harrison grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door and shoved his arms through the sleeves with more force than necessary. His jaw was set so tight it ached as he followed Tom out into the bitter cold. The main street of Fort Laramie was nearly deserted, with only a few hardy souls braving the weather. The stagecoach sat in front of the general store, its horses stamping and snorting clouds of steam into the frozen air. And there she stood. She was the most ill-prepared person Harrison had ever seen for Wyoming winter. She wore a thin traveling dress in pale blue, completely inappropriate for the weather, and her coat looked like it might have been suitable for a Boston autumn, but was absolutely useless against the Wyoming cold. She was shivering so violently that Harrison could see it from 20 feet away. A ridiculous hat sat askew on her head, decorated with what might have once been flowers but now looked like frozen debris. At her feet sat 3 large trunks and, inexplicably, a bird cage covered with a cloth. As Harrison approached, she turned toward him, and he got his first clear look at her face. She was young, probably around 23 or 24, with delicate features and large eyes that looked far too hopeful for someone who was about to have her entire world upended. Her lips were tinged blue from the cold, and her teeth were chattering so hard he could hear them clicking together. "Are you Mr. Harrison Cole?" she asked, her voice shaking from both cold and nerves. She attempted what was probably meant to be a graceful step toward him, but her frozen skirts tangled around her legs, and she stumbled forward directly into a water trough that had frozen solid overnight. The impact sent her sprawling across the ice-covered trough with a yelp of surprise. Her hat flew off, releasing a cascade of dark hair from its pins. The bird cage toppled over, and from beneath the cloth came a series of indignant squawks. One of her trunks fell open, spilling Lady's undergarments across the frozen ground. She lay there spread-eagled on the ice trough, her skirts hiked up to reveal sensible boots and several layers of petticoats, looking absolutely mortified. For a moment, Harrison could only stare. Then something happened that he had not experienced in 3 long years. It started as a pressure in his chest, moved up through his throat, and before he could stop it, a laugh burst from his lips. Not a small chuckle or a polite snort, but a genuine, full-bodied laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did everyone else on the street. The woman on the ice trough turned even redder, if that was possible given how cold she was. "This is not how I imagined our first meeting," she said with as much dignity as someone sprawled on a frozen water trough could muster. Harrison quickly sobered, remembering the situation, but his face still felt strange from the unfamiliar expression. He stepped forward and offered his hand to help her up. "Miss, there has been a terrible mistake." She grasped his hand with her own frozen fingers and allowed him to pull her upright. She was shorter than he had thought, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. Up close, he could see that her eyes were an unusual shade of green, like new grass in spring, and they were starting to shimmer with unshed tears as the reality of his words sank in. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not send for a mail-order bride," Harrison said as gently as he could manage. "I believe my brother may have done this without my knowledge or consent. I am very sorry you came all this way, but I cannot marry you." The tears spilled over then, tracking down her frozen cheeks. She pulled her hand from his and wrapped her arms around herself. "I see. Of course. I should have known it was too good to be true. The letters were so kind, so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe someone actually wanted me." Something twisted in Harrison's chest at those words, but he pushed it aside. "I will pay for your return trip to Boston. The next stage east leaves in 3 days once this cold spell breaks." "I cannot go back to Boston," she said quietly, bending to gather the scattered undergarments with shaking hands. "There is nothing for me there anymore." Tom stepped forward, his marshal's instincts clearly warring with his sense of compassion. "Miss, maybe you should explain your situation." "What is your name?" "Daisy Jennings," she said, shoving lace-trimmed drawers into the trunk with complete disregard for folding. "I was a governess in Boston until my employer decided I was too much of a temptation for her husband. Never mind that the man could not keep his hands to himself, and I never encouraged him in the slightest. She dismissed me without a reference and spread rumors that ensured I could not find another position. I used the last of my savings to come here. I have exactly $7.32 to my name, no family, and no prospects." She said all of this matter-of-factly while continuing to stuff items into her trunk, but Harrison could see the way her hands trembled, and he suspected it was not entirely from the cold. The bird in the cage was still squawking indignantly, adding a surreal quality to the entire scene. "What is with the bird?" Harrison found himself asking, though it was hardly the most important question at hand. "That is Penelope," Daisy said, as if that explained everything. "She is a parrot. She was my mother's. She is all I have left of my family." "Damnation!" The bird shrieked from under its cover, making Daisy wince. She has picked up some unfortunate vocabulary from the sailors on the ship, Daisy said apologetically. I am working on correcting it. Harrison dragged a hand down his face, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. This was Samuel's fault. All of it. His brother had created this disaster, and now this poor woman was stranded in Wyoming territory in the middle of winter with no money, no prospects, and a cursing parrot. You cannot stay out here in this cold, Tom said, ever practical. You will freeze to death. Harrison, your house has room. Absolutely not, Harrison said immediately. That would be completely inappropriate. Then what do you suggest? Tom pressed. The boarding house is full up with railroad surveyors. Your brother has that extra room above his barber shop. Samuel, Harrison bit out the name like a curse, is the last person who should be involved in this situation, seeing as how he created it. Daisy had managed to repack her trunk and was attempting to lift it, despite clearly lacking the strength to do so. Her face was so pale now that Harrison worried she might actually faint. He could not remember the last time he had seen someone so thoroughly unprepared for Wyoming winter. She was going to die of exposure if someone did not intervene, and despite his anger at the situation, he could not have that on his conscience. Fine, he heard himself say. She can stay in my spare room until we figure something out, but this is temporary, Miss Jennings. Just until the stage runs again and you can go somewhere more suitable. Daisy stopped struggling with the trunk and looked up at him with those enormous green eyes. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I promise I will not be any trouble. Even as she said it, she took a step backward and collided with the bird cage, sending it sliding across the icy ground. The cloth flew off, revealing an indignant green parrot with a bright red head, who immediately began screeching every curse word in her considerable vocabulary at the top of her lungs. Several passing townsfolk stopped to stare, and Harrison could already imagine the gossip that would be flying through Fort Laramie by nightfall. He gathered Daisy's trunks with ease that spoke of years of physical labor and jerked his head toward the end of the street. My house is this way. Can you manage the bird? Yes, of course. Daisy scooped up the cage, cooing apologies to Penelope, and hurried after him as quickly as her frozen skirts would allow. Harrison's house sat at the edge of town, a sturdy two-story structure he had built with his own hands during the first year of his marriage. He had added every detail with care, thinking about the family he and Margaret would raise there, the life they would build. Now it stood as a monument to all he had lost, and he spent as little time there as possible. He kicked open the front door and deposited the trunks in the entryway. The house was cold, since he rarely bothered to keep more than a small fire going, and his breath fogged in the air. Daisy followed him inside, still shivering violently, and set Penelope's cage on a small table. I will get a fire going, Harrison said, already moving toward the fireplace in the main room. There are blankets in the chest upstairs. The spare room is the second door on the right. Mr. Cole, Daisy began, but he cut her off. We can talk after you warm up. You are half frozen. Get out of those wet clothes and wrap yourself in something warm. She nodded and made her way carefully up the stairs, leaving small puddles from her frozen skirts as she went. Harrison focused on building up the fire, coaxing the flames to life with practiced efficiency. Once heat began radiating from the fireplace, he went to the kitchen and set water to boil for tea. The domestic tasks felt strange after so long. He usually just ate cold meals and drank coffee, not bothering with anything more elaborate. It was a good 20 minutes before Daisy reappeared, wrapped in what looked like 3 quilts, and with her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders as it dried. Her face had regained some color, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. She had clearly been crying upstairs. "Sit by the fire," Harrison said, gesturing to one of the chairs he rarely used. "I made tea." "You did not have to do that," she said softly, but she took the offered chair gratefully and accepted the steaming cup he handed her. She wrapped her fingers around it, absorbing the warmth. Harrison took the other chair, maintaining a respectful distance. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, awkwardness settled over them like a heavy blanket. He had not been alone in a room with a woman since Margaret died. He had not wanted to be. "I truly am sorry about the confusion," Daisy said finally. "The letters I received were so detailed. They talked about life in Wyoming, about the ranch and the horses, about wanting to start fresh but not wanting to do it alone. I thought I was entering into an agreement with someone who genuinely wanted a partner." "My brother wrote those letters," Harrison said heavily. "Samuel owns the barber shop in town. He has been after me for months to move on with my life. I suppose he thought this was the solution." "Move on from what?" Daisy asked, then immediately looked mortified. "I apologize. That is none of my business." Harrison stared into the fire for a long moment, debating whether to answer. He never talked about Margaret and the baby. Never. But something about this strange, clumsy woman who had traveled across the country based on lies made him feel like he owed her some explanation. "My wife and daughter died 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Margaret died in childbirth, and the baby only lived a few hours. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like someone else's life entirely." "I am so sorry," Daisy whispered, and the genuine sympathy in her voice made Harrison's throat tighten. "It is what it is," he said roughly. "Samuel thinks I need to move on, find someone new, start over. He does not understand that I am not interested in replacing what I lost." "That is why you have not smiled in so long," Daisy said. It was not a question. Harrison looked at her sharply. "How would you know anything about that?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "When you laughed earlier after I fell, the marshal looked like he had seen a ghost." And several people on the street actually stopped and stared. It seemed clear that seeing you laugh was unusual. "I have not had much cause for laughter," Harrison said. "I imagine not." Daisy took a sip of her tea, then added quietly, "Though I suppose it is rather ironic that my complete humiliation was the thing to make you break your streak. I assure you that falling over frozen water troughs is not a regular habit of mine." Falling over other things, perhaps, but not usually water troughs. Despite himself, Harrison felt his lips twitch. "You admit to being clumsy then?" "Oh, terribly," Daisy said with a weak smile. "My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow. I knocked over 3 vases and a grandfather clock in my last employer's home, though in my defense, the grandfather clock was already unstable." "That is quite a record," Harrison said dryly. "I do try," Daisy replied, and this time her smile was a bit stronger. They fell into silence again, but it was slightly less uncomfortable now. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house and reminding them both that winter in Wyoming was not to be trifled with. "What will you do?" Harrison asked finally. "If you truly cannot return to Boston?" Daisy set down her teacup and pulled the quilts tighter around herself. "I honestly do not know. I suppose I should look for employment, but I have no idea what opportunities might exist in a place like Fort Laramie. I am educated and can teach, but I doubt there is much call for governesses on the frontier." "There is a school," Harrison said slowly. "The teacher is a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She might know of families needing help with children. And Sarah Chen, who runs the general store, is always looking for help, especially during the busy season." "That is kind of you to think of," Daisy said. "I will inquire tomorrow if the weather permits." "You should stay inside until the cold breaks," Harrison said. "You are not equipped for this weather. In the morning I will see about getting you some proper winter clothes. You cannot walk around town in those thin dresses." "I cannot accept more charity," Daisy protested. "You have already done more than enough." "It is not charity, it is practicality," Harrison countered. "If you are going to be here even temporarily, you need appropriate clothing. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of watching you fall on that water trough." Daisy's face flushed pink. "You are never going to let me forget that, are you?" "Probably not," Harrison said, and was surprised to find himself almost smiling again. What was happening to him? From her cage, Penelope chose that moment to shriek, "Hell and damnation," at the top of her lungs, making them both jump. "I really am working on her vocabulary," Daisy said apologetically. "Right," Harrison said. "I can see you are making excellent progress." They talked a bit more as the afternoon wore on, carefully avoiding any topics too personal or painful. Harrison learned that Daisy was 24 years old, had grown up in Boston, and had been supporting herself as a governess since her parents died 5 years earlier. She had a quick wit when she was not devastated by having her marriage prospects literally fall through, and despite himself, Harrison found her easy to talk to in a way he had not experienced in years. As evening approached, Harrison excused himself to go speak with his brother. The cold had not abated, but his fury kept him plenty warm as he stalked through the frozen streets toward Samuel's barber shop. He found his younger brother just closing up for the day, and the guilty expression on Samuel's face when he saw Harrison confirmed everything. "Before you say anything," Samuel began, holding up his hands, "I want you to know that I did this because I love you and I am worried about you." Harrison grabbed Samuel by his coat front and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle the bottles on the shelves. "You had no right." "No right at all, Samuel. You are killing yourself," Samuel shot back, not bothering to struggle against his brother's grip. "You spend every waking moment working. You do not eat properly, you do not sleep, you do not talk to anyone. It has been 3 years, Harrison. Margaret would not have wanted this for you." "Do not," Harrison said through clenched teeth, "presume to tell me what my wife would have wanted. You barely knew her." "I knew her well enough to know she loved you and would be heartbroken to see what you have become," Samuel said. "You are my brother and you are disappearing right in front of me. I had to do something." Harrison released Samuel and stepped back, his hands shaking with anger and something else he did not want to name. "So you arranged a marriage. You forged letters and made promises in my name to a woman who has now traveled across the country for nothing. I hoped that maybe once she got here, once you met her, you might see that life could still hold something good," Samuel said quietly. "I know it was wrong. I know I overstepped. But I was desperate, Harrison. I miss my brother, the real you, not this ghost who goes through the motions of living." Some of the fury drained out of Harrison at the raw emotion in Samuel's voice. His brother was 25, only 3 years younger, but sometimes the gap felt much wider. Samuel had always been the optimistic one, the one who saw possibility where others saw only obstacles. It was one of the things Harrison had always loved about him, even when it was infuriating. "You cannot fix this with schemes and tricks," Harrison said wearily. "Grief does not work that way." "I know," Samuel said, "but maybe friendship could. Maybe just having someone else in that empty house could help. I am not saying you have to marry her, but would it be so terrible to have some company? To remember what it is like to connect with another person?" Harrison thought about Daisy sitting by his fire, wrapped in quilts, talking about her clumsy tendencies with self-deprecating humor. He thought about how he had laughed for the first time in 3 years at the sight of her sprawled across that water trough. He thought about the fleeting moment when the constant ache in his chest had eased just slightly. "She needs a place to stay until she can find work," Harrison said finally. "That is all this is. She is stranded here because of your actions, so the least I can do is make sure she does not freeze or starve." "Of course," Samuel agreed quickly, though Harrison could see the spark of hope in his brother's eyes that made him want to punch something. "That is very decent of you." "Do not read anything more into this," Harrison warned. "I am not looking for a wife. I am not looking to move on. I am simply helping someone in need because it is the right thing to do." "I understand completely," Samuel said, but the small smile on his face suggested otherwise. Harrison left before he could say something he would regret and made his way back home through the frozen darkness. The house was warm when he entered, and he could smell something cooking. He followed his nose to the kitchen and found Daisy standing at his stove, still wrapped in quilts, stirring a pot of what looked like soup. "I hope you do not mind," she said quickly when she saw him. "I found some vegetables and salt pork in your pantry, and I thought I should make myself useful." "It is not much, but it is hot." Harrison should tell her she did not need to cook for him. He should maintain proper distance and boundaries. Instead, he found himself saying, "It smells good. I cannot remember the last time I had a proper meal." "Then you should sit," Daisy said, gesturing to the small kitchen table. "It is almost ready." He sat, feeling strange in his own kitchen, and watched as she ladled soup into 2 bowls with the careful concentration of someone trying very hard not to spill anything. She managed to get the bowls to the table without incident, though she did trip slightly over the edge of the quilt trailing behind her. The soup was simple but hearty, and Harrison found himself actually hungry for the first time in recent memory. They ate in companionable silence for a while before Daisy spoke. "Did you speak with your brother?" "I did," Harrison said. "He admitted to everything. He thought he was helping." "He cares about you," Daisy observed. "That much is clear." "He interferes," Harrison corrected. "There is a difference." "Sometimes they are the same thing," Daisy said gently. "When my parents died, I had a friend who kept showing up at my apartment with food and forcing me to eat even when I insisted I was fine. I found it annoying at the time, but looking back, I realized she probably saved my life. Sometimes the people who care about us see things we cannot." Harrison did not want to think too deeply about what Samuel might be seeing, so he changed the subject. "I spoke to Sarah Chen at the general store. She says she can use help a few days a week if you are interested. The pay is not much, but it is something." Daisy's face lit up. "Really? Oh, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Cole." "Harrison," he said. "If you are staying under my roof, even temporarily, you might as well call me Harrison." "Then you should call me Daisy," she replied with a shy smile. Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected routine. The cold spell continued, keeping most people indoors and making travel impossible. Daisy kept house while Harrison worked in his shop, and in the evenings, they shared meals and conversation. It was strange having someone else in his space after so long alone, but Harrison found it was not as uncomfortable as he had anticipated. Daisy was remarkably easy to be around despite her tendency to knock things over. She tripped on the stairs at least once a day, dropped dishes with alarming frequency, and somehow managed to tangle herself in the curtains while simply trying to look out the window. But she also laughed at herself, never took her mishaps too seriously, and had a dry wit that caught Harrison off guard more than once. On the 3rd evening, Harrison came home to find Daisy standing on a chair trying to reach something on a high shelf. Even before he could call out a warning, the chair wobbled, and she lost her balance with a startled yelp. Harrison lunged forward and caught her before she hit the ground, his arms closing around her waist as she fell backward into his chest. For a moment, they both froze. Harrison could feel the warmth of her body through the layers of clothing, could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. She was soft and alive in his arms in a way that made his heart clench painfully. It had been so long since he had held another person, since he had felt this kind of physical connection. Daisy looked up at him, her green eyes wide and startled, and he could see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat. Her lips were slightly parted, and for one insane moment, Harrison wondered what it would be like to kiss her. Then reality crashed back in, and he set her carefully on her feet, stepping back quickly. "You need to be more careful," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You could have seriously hurt yourself." "I know," Daisy said breathlessly, her cheeks flushed. "I am sorry. I was trying to reach the good plates. I thought we could eat in the dining room for a change." "The kitchen is fine," Harrison said curtly. "I am going to wash up." He fled to the washroom, his heart pounding. What was he doing? He had no business having thoughts like that about Daisy. She was here temporarily, just until she got on her feet. She was not Margaret. She could never be Margaret. And he had no right to even consider the possibility of anything more. When he returned to the kitchen, Daisy had set the table and was dishing out stew with exaggerated care. The awkwardness from earlier hung between them, making the meal stilted and uncomfortable. Harrison excused himself as soon as he finished eating, claiming he had work to do in his shop. The truth was he needed to clear his head. He needed to remember why he had built walls around his heart and why letting anyone in was a terrible idea. Caring about people meant you could lose them. Love meant pain. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible, and he was not interested in repeating it. He worked late into the night, his hands moving automatically through familiar tasks while his mind churned. When he finally returned to the house in the early hours of the morning, he found a blanket draped over the chair in his workshop and a note in careful handwriting. "In case you get cold, I know grief is heavy. Take all the time you need." Something cracked in Harrison's chest at those simple words. He stood there in the darkness, clutching the note, and for the first time since Margaret died, he allowed himself to truly cry. Great wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, tears that soaked into the blanket Daisy had left for him. He cried for his wife and the daughter he had barely gotten to hold. He cried for the life they should have had, and for the man he used to be. And when the tears finally stopped, he felt emptied out but somehow lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying had shifted just slightly. The next morning he came down to find Daisy already awake making breakfast. She looked at him carefully, taking in his red-rimmed eyes and haggard appearance, but she did not comment on it. Instead, she simply poured him coffee and said, "The weather is supposed to clear today. I thought I might go into town and speak with Mrs. Patterson about teaching positions." "I will walk with you," Harrison said. "You still do not have proper winter clothes." They made the trip into town together, and Harrison found himself steering her toward the general store first. Sarah Chen greeted them warmly, her weathered face crinkling into a smile. She was a practical woman in her 40s who had come to Fort Laramie with her husband during the gold rush and stayed after he died, making a success of the general store through sheer determination. "Miss Jennings," Sarah said, "Harrison mentioned you might need work. I could certainly use help with inventory and customers, particularly when the weather improves and traffic picks up. Would 3 days a week suit you?" "That would be perfect," Daisy said gratefully. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Chen. Please call me Sarah, and welcome to Fort Laramie, though I imagine this was not the welcome you expected." Sarah shot Harrison a knowing look that made him shift uncomfortably. They spent the next hour selecting appropriate winter clothing for Daisy. Sturdy wool dresses, thick stockings, a proper coat lined with fur, and boots that would actually keep her feet warm and dry. Harrison watched as Daisy ran her hands over the fabrics with an expression of wonder, as if she had never owned anything so fine. "This is too much," she protested when she saw the growing pile. "I cannot possibly accept all of this." "You cannot possibly survive Wyoming winter without it," Harrison countered. "Consider it part of your compensation for having to put up with my brother's deception." From there, they went to the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Patterson, a stern but kind widow in her 50s, interviewed Daisy about her teaching experience. By the time they left, Daisy had agreed to help with the younger students 3 afternoons a week, giving her enough income to start saving money. As they walked back toward Harrison's house, Daisy was practically glowing with excitement. "I cannot believe it. I have work. Real work. I can start supporting myself." "You were worried you could not," Harrison observed. "I was terrified," Daisy admitted. "When I realized there had been a mistake, that you had not actually sent for me, I thought my life was over. I thought I would end up destitute or worse. But everyone here has been so kind, especially you." "I have not been especially kind," Harrison said. "I let you stay in my spare room and bought you some clothes. That is basic human decency, not kindness. You let me into your home when you clearly wanted nothing to do with me," Daisy said, stopping to face him. "You helped me find work. You have treated me with respect and consideration, even though I am the living embodiment of your brother's interference in your life. That is more than basic decency, Harrison." He did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and continued walking. But as they made their way home through the snow, he found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the way her face lit up when she talked about teaching, of how she had started to feel less like an unwelcome intruder and more like something else entirely. The realization unsettled him deeply. That evening, Samuel came by for dinner, bringing fresh bread from the bakery and an expression of wary hope. Harrison had not spoken to him since their confrontation, and the tension was obvious. "I wanted to apologize properly," Samuel said, addressing both of them. "To both of you. What I did was wrong and selfish. I should not have forged those letters or made promises in Harrison's name. Daisy, I am truly sorry for putting you in such a terrible position." "I appreciate your apology," Daisy said graciously. "Though I confess I am curious about why you thought this would work." Samuel glanced at Harrison before answering. "Because the man who wrote those letters is who my brother used to be. Before Margaret died, Harrison was the kind of person who saw beauty in the world. He smiled and laughed. He made plans for the future. I wanted to remind him that person still exists somewhere inside him." "Samuel," Harrison began, but his brother held up a hand. "I know you are angry with me and you have every right to be, but I do not regret trying to help you, even if my methods were misguided. You are my brother, and I will always fight to bring you back to life, even when you do not want me to." Harrison felt his throat tighten. "I am not sure there is anything left to bring back." "There is," Daisy said softly. They both turned to look at her in surprise. She twisted her hands nervously but continued. "You laughed when I fell. You helped me even though you did not have to. You are still capable of kindness and humor and connection. That person Samuel is talking about is not gone. He is just buried under grief." "It is not that simple," Harrison said roughly. "No, it is not," Daisy agreed. "Grief is complicated and messy and it does not follow any timeline. But that does not mean you have to let it consume you forever." The three of them had dinner together, and though it was somewhat awkward at first, eventually the conversation began to flow more naturally. Samuel told stories about the townspeople who came through his barber shop, making them both laugh with his impressions. Daisy shared tales from her governess days that were equal parts amusing and horrifying. and Harrison found himself participating more than he had in years, adding his own comments and observations. When Samuel finally left, promising to stop interfering but making no promises to stop worrying, Daisy began cleaning up the dinner dishes. Harrison moved to help her, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence. It was a domestic scene that felt both foreign and oddly right. "Your brother loves you very much," Daisy said as she handed Harrison a plate to dry. "I know," Harrison said. "That is what makes it so hard to stay angry with him." "You do not have to stop being angry," Daisy said. "But maybe you can also acknowledge that his heart was in the right place, even if his actions were misguided." Harrison dried the plate and set it aside. "When did you become so wise?" "I am not wise," Daisy said with a self-deprecating smile. "I just know what it is like to have your life torn apart and have to figure out how to keep going. After my parents died, I was so lost. I went through the motions for months, just existing but not really living. It was not until I started letting people in again, started allowing myself to connect and care, that I began to heal." "And what if you lose them too?" Harrison asked quietly. "What if you open your heart again and it gets ripped out?" Daisy turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Then at least you will have had something beautiful, even if it was brief. Is not having loved at all better than never loving because you are afraid of losing?" "I do not know," Harrison admitted. "Right now it feels like love is just setting yourself up for pain." "Maybe," Daisy said. "But it is also the thing that makes us most human. Connection, affection, caring about others, even when it hurts. That is what separates us from being just existing." They finished the dishes in thoughtful silence, and when Daisy excused herself to go to bed, Harrison found himself standing alone in his kitchen, thinking about her words. He had been just existing for 3 years, going through the motions but not really living. He had told himself it was enough, that work and routine could sustain him. But lately, with Daisy in his house and in his life, he had started to feel flickers of something more. Interest, engagement, even joy. It terrified him. The following weeks slipped into a pattern that felt almost normal. Daisy worked her shifts at the general store and the school, quickly becoming a familiar and well-liked presence in Fort Laramie. Harrison continued his saddle making, and in the evenings, they shared meals and conversation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Harrison found himself looking forward to coming home, anticipating Daisy's stories about her day and the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed. She was still hopelessly clumsy. She managed to spill flour all over the kitchen while attempting to bake bread, got her skirt caught in a door and ripped the hem, and somehow knocked over an entire display of canned goods at the general store. But she took it all in stride, laughing at herself and cleaning up her messes without complaint. Harrison found himself smiling more often, though he tried to hide it. He would catch himself looking for excuses to spend time with her, offering to walk her to work even when the weather was fine, and she did not need an escort. He started coming home earlier, telling himself it was just because the days were getting longer, but knowing it was because he wanted to see her. One evening in early spring, when the worst of the winter had finally broken and the first hints of green were appearing on the hillsides, Daisy was attempting to hang new curtains in the main room. Harrison came home to find her balanced precariously on a ladder, stretching to reach the curtain rod. "Daisy, get down from there before you break your neck," he said, his heart leaping into his throat at the sight of her wobbling on the high rungs. "I almost have it," she said, reaching just a bit farther. It happened in slow motion. The ladder shifted, Daisy's foot slipped, and she fell with a startled cry. Harrison lunged forward, catching her against his chest for the second time. But this time, the momentum carried them both backward. and they tumbled onto the sofa together, with Daisy landing on top of him in a tangle of skirts and limbs. For a moment, they both just lay there, breathing hard. Daisy's face was inches from Harrison's, her hair coming loose from its pins to fall around them like a curtain. He could feel every curve of her body pressed against his, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could count each individual freckle scattered across her nose. "I am so sorry," Daisy whispered, but she did not move. "You really need to stop falling off things," Harrison said, but his voice came out husky. "I know," Daisy said. "It is a terrible habit." They stared at each other, and Harrison felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was not just tolerance or friendship. This was want. This was longing. This was the terrifying, exhilarating feeling of his heart opening again after being closed for so long. "Daisy," he said quietly, and it was both a question and a statement. She must have heard everything he was not saying in that single word because her eyes widened. "Harrison." Whatever she was going to say was interrupted by a loud squawk from Penelope, who chose that moment to screech "bloody hell" at the top of her lungs. The spell broke and Daisy scrambled off Harrison, her face flushed bright red. "I should finish those curtains," she said quickly, not meeting his eyes. "Maybe using a stool this time instead of the ladder." "Right," Harrison said, sitting up and trying to get his racing heart under control. "That would probably be safer." They did not talk about what had almost happened, but the awareness hung between them like smoke. Harrison found himself unable to stop thinking about the weight of her in his arms, the softness of her body, the way she had looked at him with her lips parted, and her eyes dark with something he was afraid to name. That night, lying alone in his bed, Harrison finally admitted to himself what had been growing for weeks. He had feelings for Daisy. Real, genuine, terrifying feelings that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. She made him laugh. She made him think. She made him want to be better than the shell of a man he had become. But that admission brought a crushing wave of guilt. How could he feel this way about someone else when Margaret had been the love of his life? How could he even consider moving forward when his wife and daughter were barely 3 years in the ground? What kind of man did that make him? He spent a sleepless night wrestling with these questions, and in the morning he was distant and short-tempered. Daisy noticed immediately, giving him worried looks over breakfast, but she did not press him. She left for her shift at the general store, and Harrison went to his workshop, where he attacked a saddle with more force than necessary. Samuel found him there several hours later, bent over his workbench with a scowl on his face. "You look like you are trying to murder that leather," Samuel observed, leaning against the door frame. "What do you want?" Harrison asked without looking up. "To check on my brother, who has apparently regressed back to being an angry hermit," Samuel said. "Things seem to be going well with Daisy. What happened?" "Nothing happened," Harrison said shortly. "That is obviously a lie," Samuel said. "Come on, Harrison, talk to me." Harrison threw down his tools with more force than necessary and turned to face his brother. "I have feelings for her. All right. Are you happy? Your ridiculous plan is working. I have feelings for Daisy, and it is tearing me apart because I have no right to feel this way. Margaret has only been gone 3 years. Samuel crossed the workshop and put a hand on Harrison's shoulder. "There is no timeline for grief, but there is also no rule that says you have to be alone forever. Margaret loved you. She would want you to be happy." "You did not even know her that well," Harrison said roughly. "You barely spent time with us after we married." "I knew her well enough," Samuel said firmly. "And I knew how much she loved you. The kind of love you two shared does not die, Harrison. It does not get erased or replaced. But that does not mean your heart cannot make room for someone new. Love is not a finite resource." Harrison wanted to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. Deep down, he knew Samuel was right. Margaret had been generous and kind and full of life. She never would have wanted him to spend the rest of his days alone and miserable. "I am afraid," Harrison admitted quietly. "What if I lose Daisy too? What if I let myself care and something happens? I barely survived losing Margaret and the baby. I cannot go through that again." "You might not have to," Samuel said. "But you cannot live your life based on fear of what might happen. That is not living, Harrison. That is just waiting to die." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow because they were true. For 3 years, he had been doing exactly that, waiting to die, going through the motions but not really living. Daisy had brought color back into his gray world, had reminded him what it felt like to truly be alive. Was he really going to throw that away because he was afraid? "What if she does not feel the same way?" Harrison asked. Samuel actually laughed. "Are you serious right now? Harrison, that woman looks at you like you hung the moon. She lights up every time you walk into a room. Half the town is taking bets on when you two will finally admit you are in love with each other." "We are not," Harrison started, but Samuel cut him off. "You are. You absolutely are. And the only question is whether you are brave enough to do something about it." Harrison sent his brother away with a lot to think about. He spent the rest of the day working, but his mind was not on leather and stitching. It was on green eyes and self-deprecating humor, and the way Daisy hummed while she cooked. It was on how his house had stopped feeling like a tomb and started feeling like a home again. It was on the possibility of a future that included more than just work and solitude. When he finally returned home that evening, he found Daisy in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She looked up when he entered, and her expression was guarded in a way it usually was not. "I made stew," she said carefully. "I hope that is all right." "Daisy, we need to talk," Harrison said. Her face fell, and she set down the spoon with trembling hands. "I understand. You want me to leave. I have saved enough money now that I could probably afford a room at the boarding house if—" "No," Harrison interrupted, crossing the kitchen in 3 long strides. "That is not what I want at all." She looked up at him with confused, hopeful eyes. "Then what?" Harrison took a deep breath, gathering his courage. This was the scariest thing he had done since watching them lower Margaret's coffin into the ground, but it was also necessary. "I have been dead inside for 3 years. I thought that was all I deserved, all I was capable of. But then you fell off that water trough and made me laugh, and something cracked open in my chest." Daisy's eyes widened, but she did not speak, just waited for him to continue. "You are clumsy and chaotic, and you have a parrot that curses like a sailor," Harrison continued, a smile tugging at his lips despite his nerves. "You knock things over and trip on flat surfaces and burn dinner at least once a week. And somehow, despite all of that, or maybe because of it, you have brought joy back into my life. You have reminded me what it feels like to be alive." "Harrison," Daisy whispered, her eyes shimmering with tears. "I know you did not come here to fall in love with a broken man," Harrison said. "I know this is not what you signed up for. But the truth is, Daisy, I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. And I am terrified because the last time I loved someone, I lost them. But I am more terrified of spending the rest of my life alone when I could spend it with you." A tear spilled down Daisy's cheek, but she was smiling. "You are not broken, Harrison. You are healing. And I did not come here to fall in love, but I did anyway. How could I not? You are kind and strong and so much braver than you give yourself credit for. You lost everything and you are still here, still fighting to find reasons to live. That is not broken. That is incredibly courageous." Harrison reached up and gently wiped away her tear with his thumb. "So what do we do now? I think you kiss me," Daisy said with a watery laugh. "That seems like the logical next step." Harrison cupped her face in his hands. marveling at how perfectly she fit in his palms, and slowly lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of each other. But then Daisy made a small sound of need and pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that made Harrison's head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against Daisy's and smiled. A real, genuine, full smile that felt like coming home. "I love you," he said, because now that he had admitted it once, he wanted to say it again and again. "I love you too," Daisy replied. "Even though you are grumpy and you work too much and you have not smiled in years." "I am smiling now," Harrison pointed out. "Yes, you are," Daisy said, her own smile radiant. "And it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the moment. When they finally separated, Daisy gasped and pointed at the stove. "The stew." Harrison turned to see smoke rising from the pot. In their distraction, they had let dinner burn completely. They both started laughing, and Harrison could not remember the last time something so simple had brought him such pure joy. "I guess we are eating at the hotel tonight," he said. "That is probably for the best," Daisy agreed. "My cooking is questionable even when I am not distracted by declarations of love." They went to the hotel restaurant, and if the other diners noticed Harrison holding Daisy's hand or the way they kept smiling at each other like fools, nobody commented. Fort Laramie was a small town, and good news traveled fast. By morning, everyone would know that the grieving cowboy who had not smiled in years had finally found a reason to live again. Over the next several months, Harrison and Daisy built a life together. It was not always easy. Harrison still had days when grief hit him like a physical blow, when the memories of Margaret and their daughter were too painful to bear. But Daisy was patient during those dark moments, giving him space when he needed it and comfort when he would accept it. She never tried to replace what he had lost, never asked him to forget. She simply stood beside him and helped him carry the weight. For her part, Daisy continued to be spectacularly clumsy. She fell down the stairs so often that Harrison installed a second railing. She broke more dishes than they owned. She once managed to get tangled in laundry hanging on the line and brought the entire thing crashing down. But Harrison found he loved even her mishaps because they were so uniquely her. In June, when the wild roses were blooming on the hillsides and the days were long and warm, Harrison took Daisy on a picnic to a spot overlooking the valley. They spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and ate cold chicken and fresh bread while watching hawks circle overhead. "I want to marry you," Harrison said suddenly. Daisy turned to him in surprise. "What?" "I want to marry you," Harrison repeated. "Not because my brother forged letters or because you traveled all this way, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." "Will you marry me, Daisy Jennings?" Daisy threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking them both over in the process. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Harrison pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. It was not the ring he had given Margaret, he had buried that with her, but something he had commissioned from the jeweler in town specifically for Daisy. He slipped it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the Fort Laramie chapel. Samuel served as best man, grinning like he had personally orchestrated the entire thing, which in a way he had. Sarah Chen and Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row with several other townspeople who had become friends. Even Penelope attended, though she was mercifully quiet during the actual vows. Harrison had thought he would feel guilty on his wedding day, that Margaret's memory would haunt him. But instead, as he watched Daisy walk down the aisle toward him in a simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair, he felt only joy and gratitude. He would always love Margaret and the life they had briefly shared. But he was ready to build a new life with Daisy, one that honored his past while embracing his future. Their first year of marriage was full of adjustments and compromises and moments of pure happiness. Harrison taught Daisy to ride a horse, though she fell off at least a dozen times before getting the hang of it. Daisy taught Harrison to dance, which he claimed to hate but secretly enjoyed. They worked together to expand his saddle business, with Daisy handling the books and correspondence while Harrison focused on the craftsmanship. The house that had stood empty and cold for so long filled with warmth and life and laughter. Harrison found himself actually eager to come home each day, knowing Daisy would be there waiting for him. They had dinner together every night, sharing stories about their days and making plans for the future. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's company in a way that felt both new and timeless. In the spring of 1880, Daisy told Harrison she was expecting a baby. His initial reaction was pure terror. The memories of losing Margaret during childbirth came flooding back, and for several days he was nearly paralyzed with fear. But Daisy was patient with him, letting him work through his panic while assuring him that she was healthy and strong, and that this time would be different. Harrison threw himself into preparing for the baby with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He built a cradle that was probably over-engineered to the point of being indestructible. He made sure they had access to the best midwife in the territory. He barely let Daisy lift anything heavier than a teacup, much to her amusement and occasional exasperation. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him more than once, but she never seriously objected to his hovering. When Daisy went into labor on a cool October evening, Harrison was convinced he was going to lose his mind. Samuel had to physically restrain him from bursting into the bedroom every 5 minutes to check on her. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, every sound from the bedroom making Harrison's heart stop. But then, just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, he heard the strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. The midwife emerged a few minutes later with a smile on her face. "You have a son, Mr. Cole, and your wife is doing just fine." Harrison's knees nearly buckled with relief. Samuel had to steady him as he made his way into the bedroom, where Daisy was propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "Come meet your son," Daisy said softly. Harrison approached on shaking legs and looked down at the baby for the first time. He was perfect. Tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect. Dark hair stuck up from his head in every direction, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same green as Daisy's. "Can I hold him?" Harrison asked, his voice rough with emotion. Daisy carefully transferred the baby into Harrison's arms, showing him how to support the head. Harrison held his son with the utmost care, marveling at how something so small could be so perfect. Tears streamed down his face unchecked. "He is beautiful," Harrison whispered. "You are both beautiful." "What should we name him?" Daisy asked. Harrison thought for a long moment. He thought about his daughter who had lived only hours, about Margaret who had died bringing her into the world. He thought about Samuel, who had refused to give up on him. And he thought about this new life he had built with Daisy, this second chance he had never expected to have. "Henry," Harrison said. "Henry Samuel Cole," Daisy smiled. "It is perfect." Adjusting to life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Harrison had forgotten how demanding newborns could be, though in truth he had barely had time to learn it the first time. But he threw himself into fatherhood with devotion, sharing the nighttime feedings and diaper changes, walking the floor with Henry when he cried, marveling at every tiny milestone. Daisy was a natural mother, though she did manage to maintain her signature clumsiness. She once tripped while carrying Henry and executed what Harrison could only describe as an impressive gymnastic maneuver to ensure the baby did not hit the ground, even though it meant she crashed into the wall instead. She fell asleep during feedings more than once, and Harrison would find her in the rocking chair with Henry cradled safely in her arms while she snored softly. Samuel was a devoted uncle, visiting often and spoiling his nephew shamelessly. He would hold Henry for hours, making funny faces and telling stories, and Harrison would watch his brother with gratitude and love. Samuel had been right all along. Harrison had needed to move forward to open his heart again. He would be forever grateful that his brother had cared enough to interfere, even if his methods had been questionable. As Henry grew from an infant into a toddler, the Cole house was filled with noise and chaos and joy. The boy had inherited his mother's tendency toward clumsiness and his father's determination, which made for some interesting combinations. He was constantly falling down, bumping into things and getting into mischief, but he was also loving and curious and full of life. On Henry's second birthday, the family gathered for a celebration. Samuel brought gifts, Sarah Chen provided a cake, and several other friends from town stopped by. Harrison stood in his crowded house, watching Daisy chase their giggling son around the room while Penelope squawked encouragement and felt overwhelmed with happiness. "You know," Samuel said, coming to stand beside him, "you are smiling again, not just occasionally but all the time." "I have a lot to smile about," Harrison said, watching Daisy scoop up Henry and blow raspberries on his stomach, making the boy shriek with laughter. "I told you that woman was special," Samuel said smugly. "You forged letters and tricked a stranger into traveling across the country," Harrison pointed out, though there was no heat in his words. "And look how well it turned out," Samuel replied, completely unrepentant. Harrison could not argue with that logic. Yes, Samuel's methods had been misguided and wrong, but they had also brought Daisy into his life. They had given him a second chance at happiness he never would have sought out on his own. "Thank you," Harrison said quietly, "for not giving up on me." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. "That is what brothers are for, though I expect you to name your next child after me too." "We are not having another child," Harrison said automatically, but even as he spoke, he saw Daisy's hand drift to her stomach in a gesture he recognized. Their eyes met across the room and she smiled in a way that confirmed his suspicion. "You were saying," Samuel asked, having caught the exchange. "I am going to need to build more cradles," Harrison muttered, but he was smiling as he said it. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after Harrison's first wife, was born the following spring. This time Harrison was less terrified, though no less devoted. If anything, having already experienced Henry's birth gave him confidence that Daisy would be all right. Rose, as they called her, had her father's dark hair and serious eyes but her mother's sunny disposition. She was the only person in the family who was not clumsy, moving with a grace that seemed to skip a generation. By the time she was 3 and Henry was 5, the house was in constant cheerful chaos. Harrison expanded his business to include a storefront in town, hiring additional craftsmen to help with the increasing demand for his saddles and leather goods. Daisy managed the business side while still teaching part-time at the school. Between the children, the business, and their life in Fort Laramie, their days were full and busy and rich with purpose. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Daisy back to the spot where he had proposed. They left the children with Samuel for the afternoon and rode out to the cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. It was a perfect summer day, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked as they sat on the blanket, Daisy leaning back against his chest. Getting on that stage to come out here, finding out it was all based on lies. Daisy was quiet for a moment, thoughtful. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had stayed in Boston. If I had found a way to rebuild there. But no, I do not regret coming here. Even in those first terrible moments when I realized you had not sent for me, I do not think I truly regretted it. It felt like an adventure, like a chance at something new. You tripped and fell on a water trough in front of half the town, Harrison reminded her. Yes, well, I made an impression, Daisy said with a laugh. And I made you laugh. That alone made the entire journey worthwhile. Harrison tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I was so lost. I did not even realize how lost until you showed up and started tripping over everything in sight. I gave you a purpose, Daisy teased, making sure I did not kill myself. You gave me more than that, Harrison said seriously. You gave me a reason to live again. You showed me that my heart was capable of more than just grief. You taught me how to be happy again. Daisy turned in his arms so she could face him. You did the same for me. I was so alone in Boston. I had no family, no real friends, just employers who saw me as a servant. Coming here, building a life with you, having our children, it has been everything I never knew I wanted. They kissed, slow and sweet, with the summer sun warm on their faces and the whole valley spread out below them. It was a perfect moment, the kind that Harrison treasured because he knew how rare and precious they were. As the years passed, the Cole family continued to grow and thrive. Harrison and Daisy added a third child to their family, another son they named Thomas, and their house was never quiet. The children grew up surrounded by love and laughter, learning their father's work ethic and their mother's resilience. Henry showed an early aptitude for leatherwork and spent hours in Harrison's workshop learning the trade. Rose was brilliant with numbers and books, already reading at a level far beyond her years. And Thomas, the baby, was fearless and adventurous, constantly giving his parents heart attacks with his antics. Samuel never did marry, claiming he was too busy being the best uncle in Wyoming territory. He was a constant presence in their lives, teaching the children tricks and telling them stories and occasionally conspiring with them to pull pranks on their parents. Harrison pretended to be annoyed but was secretly delighted that his children had such a devoted uncle. The business continued to flourish, with Harrison's saddles gaining a reputation throughout the territory for quality and craftsmanship. He trained several apprentices over the years, passing on his skills to the next generation. Daisy's organizational skills and head for business helped them expand in ways Harrison never could have managed on his own. Fort Laramie itself grew and changed around them. The military presence that had given the town its name gradually decreased as the frontier became more settled. The railroad brought more people and commerce, transforming the rough frontier outpost into a real town with churches and schools and even a proper theater. Through it all, Harrison and Daisy remained fixtures of the community, respected and loved for their kindness and generosity. Harrison never forgot Margaret and his first daughter. He visited their graves regularly, bringing flowers and telling them about his life, about Henry and Rose and Thomas, about Daisy and the happiness she had brought him. He no longer felt guilty about moving forward. Instead, he felt grateful that he had been given the chance to love deeply twice in one lifetime, something not everyone got to experience. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Daisy by arranging for Samuel to watch the children for an entire week. They took a trip to Cheyenne, staying in a hotel and seeing the sights like the tourists they were. It was strange being away from the children, from their routine, but also wonderful to have time just the two of them. On their last night, as they sat in the hotel restaurant over dinner, Daisy reached across the table and took Harrison's hand. "You remember when I first arrived?" she asked. "When I fell on that water trough and you laughed? I remember thinking you were the most ill-prepared person I had ever seen for Wyoming winter," Harrison said with a smile, "and wondering how you had survived the journey." "I remember thinking you had the saddest eyes I had ever seen," Daisy said, "and hoping that maybe I could help somehow, even though you clearly did not want me there." "I did not want anyone there," Harrison admitted. "I had convinced myself I was better off alone, that I deserved to be miserable for the rest of my life, because I had survived when Margaret and the baby did not." "And now?" Daisy asked. Harrison raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Now I know that living well, loving fully, and finding joy is not a betrayal of what I lost. It is honoring it. Margaret loved life. She would have hated seeing me waste mine in grief. You helped me understand that." "We helped each other," Daisy said. "I was just as lost as you were, just in a different way. We found each other at exactly the right time. Even if my idiot brother had to trick you into coming," Harrison added. "Even then," Daisy agreed with a laugh. "Though I will never let Samuel forget that I traveled all the way across the country to marry a man who had not actually sent for me. He will never let me forget that his insane plan actually worked," Harrison countered. They laughed together, comfortable in the life they had built and the love they shared. It had not been a simple or easy journey for either of them. They had both known loss and pain and uncertainty. But they had found each other in the chaos, two broken people who had somehow become whole together. When they returned to Fort Laramie, their children mobbed them at the door, all talking at once about what they had done while their parents were gone. Samuel looked exhausted but happy, admitting that watching three energetic children for a week had given him a new appreciation for what Harrison and Daisy managed every day. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. The children grew older, becoming more independent but no less beloved. Henry turned 15 and began seriously talking about taking over the saddle shop someday. Rose, at 13, announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother. And Thomas, at 11, changed his mind about his future career approximately once a week, bouncing between wanting to be everything from a sheriff to a railroad engineer. Harrison and Daisy grew older too, their dark hair acquiring threads of silver, their faces gaining the lines that came from years of laughter and love. But they remained devoted to each other, still stealing kisses in the kitchen when they thought the children were not looking, still holding hands on their evening walks, still finding joy in the simple fact of being together. One evening, when the children were occupied with their own pursuits and the house was relatively quiet, Harrison found Daisy standing at the window looking out at the sunset. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different my life could have been," Daisy said, leaning back into his embrace. "If I had not answered that advertisement, if I had not gotten on that stage, if you had sent me away immediately instead of letting me stay." "Do you wish things had been different?" Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not for a single moment," Daisy said firmly. "Even with all the fear and uncertainty at the beginning, even falling on that water trough in front of everyone, even discovering the man I thought wanted to marry me had not actually sent for me, I would not change a thing. Because all of that led to this. To you, to our children, to this life we have built together." Harrison turned her in his arms so he could see her face. Even after all these years, she could still take his breath away. "I love you, Daisy Cole. You made me laugh again when I thought I had forgotten how. You brought color back into my world when everything was gray, You gave me a future when all I had was a painful past." "I love you too," Daisy said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You gave me a home when I was lost. You showed me what true partnership looks like. You proved that taking risks and being vulnerable can lead to the most beautiful things." They kissed, surrounded by the life they had created together. The home filled with love and laughter and the occasional sound of something breaking, because even after all these years, Daisy could still manage to knock things over. That night, as Harrison lay in bed with Daisy curled against his side, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. He thought about the grieving cowboy who had not smiled in years, whose brother had been desperate enough to forge letters and arrange for a mail-order bride. He thought about the clumsy woman from Boston who had fallen off a water trough and somehow broken through the walls around his heart. He thought about Samuel's interference and how angry he had been at the time, not realizing his brother was trying to save his life. He thought about Margaret and their daughter, buried in the Fort Laramie cemetery, and sent them a silent thank you for the love they had shared, however brief. And he thought about Henry and Rose and Thomas, sleeping in their rooms down the hall, the living legacy of the second chance he had been given. Life was unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but it was also capable of extraordinary beauty and grace. Harrison had learned that lesson the hard way, through loss and grief and years of isolation. But he had also learned that healing was possible, that love could bloom even in the darkest places, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected sources. Like a mail-order bride who had not actually been ordered, who tripped over everything in sight, and who had somehow managed to teach a grieving cowboy how to smile again. As Harrison drifted off to sleep, holding the woman he loved, surrounded by the family they had built together, he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey had been long and painful at times, full of false starts and fears and moments of doubt. But every step had been worth it to arrive at this moment, this life, this love. And tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new reasons to smile. Tomorrow Daisy would probably knock something over or trip on the stairs, and Harrison would catch her or help her clean up or simply laugh at the chaos she brought into his ordered world. Tomorrow, his children would fill the house with noise and laughter, and the thousand small dramas of growing up. Tomorrow he would work in his shop, creating something beautiful with his hands while Daisy managed the business and kept everything running smoothly. Tomorrow would be ordinary and extraordinary all at once, which was exactly how Harrison Cole wanted to spend the rest of his days. The grieving cowboy had become a happy man, a devoted husband, a loving father. He had learned to smile again, to laugh, to live. And it had all started with a clumsy woman falling off a water trough on a frozen winter morning in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, in the year 1878. The best accident that had ever happened to him.